Good day to everyone. We are picking back up right from yesterday, where we left, with the question mark of whether or not the changes to the trinkets, the buffs to the trinkets, as well as the changes to the Valor points, both the maximum cap and the total cap you can hold on yourself at one time, if those were intended changes, if those were just tests being made by Blizzard on the PTR without really having an intent of making it to live. Well, now it's been 24 hours basically. Now the patch is out in NA, so we must have gotten a response from Blizzard, and we did. Number one, yes, the trinkets have all gone live buffed, so that apparently was intended. We have gotten the buff to trinkets, and then the more important part is the one regarding Valor points. We have gotten the response a few hours ago from Kaivax, one of the Blizzard's CM, mentioning that there will not be a limit of 1500 Valor that you can hold at any given time. So what we saw in the PTR was true, except of course for the maximum cap. The maximum cap was showing at 8,750 simply because the PTR version of the game is a few weeks ahead of the live version. So the 8,750, it would just basically be what you can hold 6 weeks into the patch. The patch will release with the maximum cap being at 5,000. The only difference is that now you don't have a weekly maximum that you can grind 750 and the total maximum that you can hold. This, just to go over it again, is pretty good because it allows you to save Valor points for when you actually get an item you need. As you get closer to the next patch, you will be getting more and more pieces. I hope 226 pieces from the Great Vault, assuming you're not doing any mythic raiding, especially now that you can cross-realm mythic raids, so it's easier to pug, especially the first bosses. But at the very least, you can get one from the Great Vault every week, so you will get closer and closer to maxing out your gear set, and maybe you just want one item or two specific items to get to 220 via the Valor point system, and the maximum cap of 1500 was a little bit tight, a little bit narrow in the amount of Mythic Plus keys you could complete before you reached 1500, and you had to spend them somehow on something, otherwise you would have capped yourself. So it's a good change. They really cut it close right before the release with this last change to Valor. We also have some other changes which are a little bit more disappointing, unfortunately. One of the other changes that was presented for patch 9.0.5 was Potency Conduits. Potency Conduits dropping from raids. Now, this is disappointing because, yes, technically it's correct. Technically, Potency Conduits are going to be dropping from raids at the same item level that you would expect. 184 in LFR, all the way up to 226 from Mythic and 213 from Heroic. There's a problem though. So Sire Denatrius is going to drop the Covenant-based conduits. So the Covenant conduits right now are dropping from world bosses, but the world bosses cap at 200 item level. So the only other way you can get the Covenant conduits, the Covenant-themed conduits, is from Denatrius. The other problem is that there are not going to be all of the Potency conduits available in the raid. There is only going to be one per spec. So if you're playing a mage, for example, you have Magi's Brand for Arcane dropping from Zymox, you have Infernal Cascade dropping from Kel'Thas, and Icy Propulsion dropping from Sludgefist. That's it. Those are the only Potency Conduits that will be available to you. And this is going to be the same for everyone. Of course, Demon Hunter, Demon Hunters only get 2 because they have 2 specs and Druids get 4. But that is all. So you don't actually get all of the available conduits. It's particularly bad for specs that get shafted with conduits available that aren't even the best one they use. For example, not to complain as usual, but Shaman, just to name one, doesn't even get their best in slot conduits. Elemental Shaman, for example, gets High Voltage, which is a shit conduit that nobody uses, as opposed to, for example, Fire Mage, who gets Infernal Cascade, which is their, super strong conduit, which is stronger than like all of the other conduits combined. So there is also a slight difference there in terms of conduits. Unfortunately, this is going to put, I know nobody's going to do it anyways, but this is going to put more interest in Venari. You're back having to do the Mo if you want item level on your conduits. You're back having to grind some Stygia so you can keep buying those 1800 Stygia cost items that upgrade the tier of one of your lowest item level conduits. So by this point, very likely, you will have most of the conduits at 200 item level at least, which means you just have to chain buy this item from Venari to upgrade them to 213 and then eventually to 226. So yeah, it's a little bit worse than expected. You could have expected all of the Potency Conduits, for example, to be available from the raid, but instead we get much less than expected. I know, it always seems a little bit ungrateful to complain when you're expecting something to be given to you for free, you know, extra, and then you get a little bit less than what you expected, and you still complain, even though it's still free, even though it's still extra. You set your expectations much higher, so now you're disappointed. Personally, I am shameless, so I will stay disappointed at this change. I never liked this whole thing with Venari, this whole cheap mechanic of keeping Stygia relevant by keeping all of the Potency Conduits hostage of this system. So I hoped that the raid would have been a nice way out of this shit system. Unfortunately, it's not. Too bad. Too bad. We have some patch notes additionally to what we are getting, to what we have went over already. There is a few more changes. There are some fixes, as usual, some bug fixes and whatnot. The main key changes are to Castonatia, Council of Blood. So we have already went over Angering Destroyer and Sunking Salvation getting nerfed. Now we get Council of Blood. I remember the good old days where I was pointing out, when we were looking at the progression of the raid, that Council of Blood was a very big cockblock. When we were looking at the kills, the difference between the kills from Inerva to Council of Blood and the difference between the guilds stuck on Council of Blood and the guilds who killed the Sludgefist, for example, Council of Blood was the big block of the raid, followed by Stone Legion Generals. They are the two hardest encounters of the raid, all in all things considered. So now Council of Blood gets another round of nerfs in Mythic difficulty, particularly. So Castellan's Fury effect has been reduced by 15% on Heroic and Mythic difficulty. Now this is not very relevant, considering people weren't even getting to this point, but in case you're doing this order, this skill order, fine. Veteran Stormguard was one of the bigger problems for this encounter. Whenever it came out, it became fucking chaos. You had your tank running for his life, trying to deal with this. The health of the Stormguard has been reduced by 10% in Mythic. Their melee damage has been reduced by 10% on all difficulties, and the Sin-Touched Blade, which is the tank, basically the tank melter, and now casts less frequently on all difficulties. The damage of Dancing Fever has been reduced by 10%. This is also pretty relevant because Dancing Fever is one of the major HPS hogs of the encounter whenever it happens. And then Dancing Fools have had their health reduced by 10% on Mythic difficulty, which is also less relevant given the majority of the guild's rotation kill order for this boss, as well as the reduction of soul spikes by 5% on all difficulties, which is also less relevant on this fight. So particularly good changes centered around the Veteran Stormguard, one of the bigger issues of this encounter, together with Dancing Fever, actually. So yeah, good changes to the fight. Other changes happen to Theater of Pain. One is a very minor buff, but still welcome. Necrolord's Chosen Covenant perk now has a duration of 6 minutes from 5, so it's 1 minute longer. It's kind of good because the position of some of these banners were in pretty early on stages of the wing of the dungeon, so you often would get to the last boss without even having the buff of the banner you would be picking at the start. Now, one bit of complaint that needs to be done about the Necrolord in this case is that they are, by quite a bit actually, the weakest covenants when it comes to buffs in dungeons. I'm sure you know the importance of the Kyrian, particularly the Kyrian Spears, as well as the Kyrian Orb that you can get in Necrotic Wake, as well as the Spears in Spires of Ascension. Those are very good buffs. Together with the Goliath Orb buffs for damage is also very good for Kyrian. Then you have Ventir, which has recently gotten buffed, particularly the Sanguine Depths buff, is now very strong. And then you have Nightfey, you have Shortcuts, you have some buffs in Mists, and then in the other side you have some pretty helpful urns to ease on the pulse that you can do for the trash count in that dungeon. But then you look at Necrolord and you're like, Jesus Christ. So Theater of Pain has a decent buff because Necrolord Chosen is giving you versatility and movement speed, which is okay. It's not great, but it's okay. And there is enough of it throughout the dungeon that it makes it decent. Now with this buff, you have 3 banners, 6 minutes each. It's 18 minutes worth of buff for the dungeon. It's basically half the dungeon you're going to have this, so it's okay. The problem is Plagueful. The buffs that you get on Plagueful for the Necrolord are pretty shit. The real problem when it comes to Covenant effects is that they don't give you any way to quickly cheat the dungeon. The other side basically has a stun, as an AoE stun, which effectively makes it much easier to do the pack you're trying to do. You have the Kyrians who have things like Spears and Orbs, which do a ton of damage, a ton of burst damage in very quick moments. And then you have Ventir, which allows you to basically make a certain mob, the gargoyle, disappear from your path, from your route. In fact, it even joins you before it disappears. Whereas Necrolord has nothing. Necrolord has a buff, has a continuous buff in Theater of Pain, and has another buff in Plagueful. It's not really anything major. I was expecting some changes. I was particularly surprised by the changes that were given in the patch that we went over to Ventir that was touched, but not Necrolord. So, sure, this buff kind of helps Necrolord in Theater of Pain, but the real issue of Necrolord was in Plagueful to begin with, not even Theater of Pain, so okay, I'm still confused about this change. What I'm not confused about, although it's pretty funny, Zira the Underhanded has been disabled on Mythic difficulty and removed from the Dungeon Journal. In case you are confused, this is Zira. In case you are still confused, this is Zira. She was the sneaky little shit casting opportunity strikes in the upfront to Challenger boss. You know, the stun, the perma stun that you needed to break with CC most of the time. Interesting, an upfront to Challengers isn't particularly difficult of a fight. I guess it was to help maybe the situation where you have an entire party without any CC available, so you just have to stand and wait and look at the guy die as he's being targeted by opportunity strikes, maybe. I'm not too sure. I don't think it's even possible to get a party without the, I guess, cycle of rotated abilities that are able to break this, but I don't know, maybe they thought it was a little bit too unfun of a mechanic, let's say. Then let's remind everyone of the change of the Mythic Keystone Dungeons that is happening this week. This week we are back to the BFA version of the Mythic Keystones, and now you get them every week. Up until now to Shadowlands you were getting a key every week from your Great Vault based on your highest key completed the entire season, regardless of when. So if your highest key was an 18, it doesn't matter if it was an 18 you did in December. It will still count for your Great Vault in what you would get the next week. Now they changed it to be, again, a weekly only deal, except unlike BFA, where the key you would get was -1 of the previous week. So if you were completing a 15, you were getting a 14, and if you were completing a 10, you were getting a 9. In 9.0.5, you will be getting the exact same level of the key that you completed the previous week, your highest key. So you are completing a 15, you're getting a 15, you're completing a 10, you're getting a 10. If you miss a week, it will go down by 1, though. So if you complete a 15, the next week you get a 15 key, which you don't do Mythic Plus, so the next week you will be getting a 14. That week you do nothing as well, then you get a 13, and then a 12, and then an 11, until you go and complete a key higher than that, and then the whole cycle is going to restart. If you want to be pedantic, it is still a nerf compared to what we had before this patch, but it is not bad as what we had in BFA. Now, as for the last minute changes to classes and specs, there was nothing except a nerf to Arms Warrior, particularly to Exploiter. Exploiter's legendary effect will now grant 25% bonus to Mortar Strike per stack in PvP, when it was 50%, and for Ventir Warriors using Condemn, it will grant an 18% bonus of Mortar Strike instead of 36. So basically they have cut the effectiveness of Exploiter in PvP, essentially. These were all of the last minute changes being applied to the patch, which is going to go live, I guess in NA it's live right now, and in EU tomorrow. Talking about the going live of this patch in the new week is also going to bring a new week of Mythic Plus. We have gone over the best Mythic Plus week of the season with Bursting and Volcanic, and now we are getting in Tyrannical, Bolstering and Storming. We are going to be having 3 weeks of sort of tough-ish Mythic Plus keys, because we are getting Tyrannical, Bolstering and Storming. Next week is going to be Fortified, Spiteful and Grievous, which is also pretty tough. And then of course 2 weeks from now we're going to go back to the worst affix, you could say, Tyrannical, Inspiring and then Necrotic. It's going to be a while before we get to Fortified, Sanguine and Quaking, which is another one of the easy push weeks. We're going to have 3 weeks that are a little bit on the other side, so I hope you did what you had to do this week on an easy week, because now it's going to be a little bit tougher. We're going to go over the actual week of Mythic Plus in more detail later on in the week, not now. For now, we can kind of stop. We have gone over all the changes. There is nothing else for the day to look at. So, stopping here. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, they need to buff Necrolord effects in dungeons by a lot.